The rain lashed against the old Victorian's windows like frantic fingers, each drop echoing the hollow ache in Arthur's chest, a relentless drumming on the silence he couldn't fill. Outside, plastered against the fogged glass of the back porch door, a silhouette shivered, a small, drowned shadow with eyes like luminous green pools, fixed unblinkingly on the empty armchair inside. It wasn't the first night the stray had appeared, drawn like a moth to the faint light within Arthur's self-imposed gloom. But tonight, the desperation radiating from the sodden creature felt different, sharper, cutting through the numbness. That had been Arthur's shield since Evelyn passed. The cat pressed its entire body against the cold pane, a silent, insistent plea, its small frame vibrating with cold and something else, a profound, unsettling urgency. It didn't meow for food, didn't scratch to be let in. It simply watched that chair, Arthur's father's old wingback, the one Evelyn had claimed with her laughter, the one now draped in a shroud of dust and memories too heavy to bear. Arthur turned away from the window, the sight of the cat, that persistent, silent vigil, twisting something raw inside him. 6 months. 6 months since the quiet hum of the oxygen machine stopped, since the vibrant warmth that was Evelyn simply vanished. The house, once filled with her music, her gentle teasing, the comforting scent of her lavender hand cream, felt cavernous, echoing only with the ghosts of their life together. He existed in the spaces between, moving from kitchen to armchair to bed, a shadow mimicking routines devoid of meaning. And every night, like clockwork since the funeral, the cat appeared. Not just any stray. This one was different. Its fur, a patchwork of storm cloud gray and charcoal, was matted, bearing the scars of life outdoors, but its eyes held an unnerving depth. An ancient knowing that seemed to pierce right through the glass, right through Arthur's carefully constructed walls, seeking him, seeking the chair. He'd tried ignoring it. He'd shooed it away gruffly the first few times it dared, linger on the porch swing Evelyn loved. But the cat always returned, unfailingly, at dusk. It didn't beg, didn't display the frantic hunger of a typical stray. It sat, unnervingly still, facing the house, specifically that window, specifically the wingback chair visible through it. Arthur found himself drawn to the window at the same time, a reluctant observer to this nightly ritual. He'd watched the cat settle, tucking its paws beneath it, its gaze unwavering, a small sentinel braving the elements. It reminded him, painfully, of the way Evelyn's ancient tabby, Mr. Paws, would sit in that very chair every evening, waiting for Arthur's father to return from work long after the old man was gone. A loyalty that defied understanding. A loyalty that now haunted his porch. Why this chair? Why this house? The questions gnawed at him, adding another layer of unease to his grief. Was it just coincidence? Or was there something more? The rain intensified, hammering the roof, turning the backyard into a churning, muddy mess. Arthur saw the cat flinch as a gust of wind rattled the porch screens, plastering its wet fur flat against its bony frame. A flicker of something akin to panic crossed its green eyes. It shifted, pressing even closer to the glass, its gaze darting, momentarily towards the shadowed alleyway bordering his property. Arthur followed its look. Was that movement near the overflowing dumpsters? A flash of something low and dark slinking away? His neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't immune either. Raccoons could be vicious, and stray dogs sometimes roamed in packs, especially on nights like this. A cold dread, separate from his grief, pricked at him. The cat wasn't just seeking shelter, it looked hunted. He remembered Evelyn's soft voice, always urging kindness to strays. You never know what battles they're fighting, Arthur. A little warmth can change a world. He clenched his fists, the familiar ache returning. Her absence was a physical weight, Could he bear opening the door, inviting another living thing into this tomb of memories? The risk felt immense. What if the cat carried disease? What if it was feral, scratched him, brought chaos into his fragile sanctuary? What if letting it in meant acknowledging a need for connection he desperately wanted to deny? He stood frozen, caught between the echo of Evelyn's compassion and the suffocating safety of his isolation. The cat turned its head slowly, those luminous eyes locking directly onto his through the rain-streaked glass. It held his gaze, unflinching, a silent communication passing between them. It wasn't pleading, it was waiting, patiently, as if it knew his struggle, as if it understood the weight of the memories anchored to that empty chair. A sudden, sharp crack split the air, not thunder, but the distinct sound of snapping wood. Arthur jumped, his heart lurching. The cat startled violently, scrambling back. From the door, fur bristling, a low, terrified hiss escaping its throat. It stared, wide-eyed, towards the side of the porch, where the old wisteria vine, heavy with rain, had just torn loose a section of the rotted railing. Debris clattered onto the steps below. The near miss seemed to shatter the cat's composure. Panic replaced its eerie calm. It paced frantically, trapped on the exposed porch, its gaze darting between the broken railing, the dark alley, and Arthur, still safely inside. Its vulnerability was suddenly terrifyingly palpable. The storm wasn't just an inconvenience. It was actively dismantling its precarious refuge. And whatever lurked in the alley seemed emboldened by the noise. Arthur saw the bushes rustle again, closer this time. A low growl, barely audible over the rain, vibrated through the night air. His breath hitched. The cat froze, ears flattened, every muscle coiled for flight. It was cornered. Driven by a surge of adrenaline that overrode his hesitation, Arthur lunged for the door handle. He couldn't leave it out there. Not like this. Not while it stared at Evelyn's chair with that same devotion Mr. Paws had shown. He fumbled with the stiff lock, his fingers clumsy with cold and sudden urgency. "Hold on!" he rasped, the first words he'd spoken aloud in days grating in his throat. "Just hold on!" He finally wrenched the lock open. The metallic screeched loud in the tense silence of the porch. He pulled the heavy wooden door inward a few inches, a sliver of warm, golden light spilling onto the wet boards. Rain immediately gusted inside, stinging his face. "Come on," he urged, his voice rough. "Get in here!" The cat stared at the open door, then back at Arthur, its green eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hesitation. It took one trembling step towards the light, towards safety, its body low to the ground. Hope, fragile and unexpected, flickered in Arthur's chest. Maybe this was a step. A tiny crack in the ice. He started to crouch, to make himself less threatening, to extend a hand, not to touch, but to guide. "It's okay," he whispered, the words feeling foreign. "Come. Inside, you're safe now." Just as the cat gathered itself to dart through the opening, a monstrous shape erupted from the shadows of the alley. It wasn't a raccoon. It was a massive, snarling dog, matted fur slick with rain, eyes blazing with feral hunger. It must have been stalking the cat, waiting for its moment. With a guttural roar that drowned out the storm, it launched itself up the porch steps, a blur of teeth and muscle, heading straight for the terrified cat, frozen in the doorway. The sheer speed, the raw ferocity, was paralyzing. Arthur had a fraction of a second to react. The cat was directly in the path. Arthur was half-crouched in the doorway, and the dog was a missile of pure aggression aimed at the threshold of his fragile peace. Safety was inches away, but death was closing in faster than thought. The dog's jaws, glistening and wide, snapped shut on empty air. The dog's jaws snapped shut with a sickening clack on empty air, propelled by its own terrifying momentum. Arthur hadn't thought. He'd reacted. Years of dormant reflexes, buried under grief, surged. As the dog lunged, Arthur threw his entire weight sideways into the heavy wooden door. It slammed shut with a thunderous bang, catching the dog's snarling muzzle and front shoulder in the jam. A high-pitched yelp of shock and pain ripped through the storm, instantly replaced by furious, muffled snarling. The impact jarred Arthur's bones, sending him staggering back into the hallway. The door vibrated violently under the frenzied assault. From the other side, thud, thud, scratch. Claws scrabbled desperately against the wood. He gasped, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Where was the cat? He'd slammed the door on the dog. But the cat had been right there. A movement at his feet. He looked down. The stray was pressed flat against the floorboards just inside the door, soaked fur plastered to its trembling body, eyes wide saucers, reflecting the hallway light, utterly silent in its terror. It hadn't run deeper into the house. It hadn't fled. It had darted in, just inches, to the only sliver of safety Arthur had been able to provide, the space behind the slammed door. It was frozen, every muscle locked, staring at the vibrating barrier separating it from death. The dog's rage was a palpable force, shaking the frame, spraying droplets of rain and saliva through the crack. One determined shove, a weaker hinge. Arthur didn't hesitate again. He lunged forward, throwing his shoulder against the shuddering door, bracing his feet. "Back!" he roared, the sound raw and unfamiliar, directed at the unseen beast. He fumbled for the deadbolt, fingers slick with rain and panic, finally sliding it home with a heavy metallic clunk. Then the chain. The immediate violent pressure against the door lessened slightly, replaced by frustrated growls and the sound of claws scraping concrete as the dog paced the porch. Thwarted but not gone. Silence descended inside, thick and trembling, broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing and the frantic drumming of the rain outside. He slumped against the door, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving him weak-kneed. Slowly, he turned his head. The cat hadn't moved. It lay like a discarded, sodden rag, its sides heaving, those luminous green eyes fixed on him, not on the door, on him. There was no hiss, no attempt to flee, just that profound, unnerving gaze, filled now with a dazed kind of trust. It had seen him act. It had seen him become the barrier. Tentatively, Arthur lowered his hand, palm open, towards the floor near the cat, not to touch, but to offer. The cat flinched almost imperceptibly, but didn't retreat. It watched his hand, then slowly, deliberately, lifted its gaze back to his face. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, fragile as spun glass in the aftermath of violence. The first bond, shared fear, shared shelter. The dog's frustrated barking faded as it finally slunk back into the storm-lashed alley, defeated. The immediate danger was past, but the cat was a pitiful sight, shivering violently, its patchwork fur, plastered with mud and rain, one hind leg held slightly off the ground. Arthur's practical mind wrestled with the emotional upheaval. He couldn't leave it like this. Evelyn's voice whispered in his memory, clearer now. "A little warmth, Arthur." He moved slowly, deliberately, fetching an old, thick towel from the linen cupboard, one Evelyn had used for gardening. He approached the cat cautiously, laying the towel a foot away. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice softer than it had been in months. "Just get warm." The cat stared at the towel, then at Arthur. With immense effort, it dragged itself onto the soft terry cloth, collapsing into a wet heap, its eyes never leaving him. Arthur gently draped another corner of the towel over its shivering form. It didn't resist. The second bond offered comfort, accepted vulnerability. The leg worried him. Was it broken? Bitten? He couldn't tell. The cat needed help he couldn't provide. The thought of bundling it into a carrier, driving to the vet, it felt overwhelming, exposing. But the image of those green eyes, trusting him after the horror on the porch, steeled him. "All right," he breathed, more to himself. "All right, let's get you looked at." He found an old cardboard box, lined it with another towel, and placed it near the cat. "In you go. Please?" To his astonishment, after a long moment of assessment, the cat, still trembling, struggled to its feet and limped painfully into the box. It settled, curling tightly, watching him. The trust was deepening, becoming tangible. The drive to the emergency vet was tense. The storm raged, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle. Every bump made the cat flinch in its box beside him on the passenger seat. Arthur kept glancing over, murmuring reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. "Nearly there. Hold on." At one point, a particularly loud crack of thunder made the cat bolt upright, panic flaring in its eyes. Without thinking, Arthur reached over, resting his hand lightly on the side of the box, not touching the cat, but letting it feel his presence. "Easy," he soothed. "Just noise. We're safe." The cat stared at his hand, then slowly, deliberately, lowered its head and pressed its damp forehead against his fingers through the cardboard. A soft, almost inaudible vibration started. Not a purr, but a tremble of relief. The third bond. Seeking contact, finding solace. The fluorescent lights of the vet clinic were harsh. The cat, now named Shadow by the triage nurse for its color and sudden appearance, was whisked away for examination. Arthur paced the sterile waiting room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in his nose, the muffled sounds of other animals a constant reminder of vulnerability. His isolation felt starkly different now. He wasn't alone in his worry. He was waiting for Shadow. The vet returned, her expression serious but not grim. "Dehydrated, malnourished, mild hypothermia," she listed. "The leg? Bad sprain, thankfully. Not broken. No bite wounds from the dog, just scrapes. Remarkable, considering." She paused, holding up a small, muddy object. "We found this tangled deep in its neck fur, almost like it was deliberately hidden. It's unusual." Arthur took it. It was a tiny, tarnished brass compass, no bigger than a thumbnail, attached to a broken fragment of thin leather collar. He wiped the mud away with his thumb. Engraved on the back, in delicate, familiar script, were words that stole his breath. "Follow your North Star. E. Evelyn." His Evelyn. She'd collected miniature curiosities. He'd given her this compass on their first hiking trip decades ago. She'd laughed, called it her adventure charm. He'd thought, it lost years ago. How? Why was it on this cat? The pieces crashed together. The nightly vigil at the chair Evelyn had loved. The uncanny persistence, the compass. This wasn't random. Shadow hadn't just been drawn to the light. It had been carrying a message, a final, whispered gift from Evelyn, delivered by a creature who seemed to understand the weight of the empty chair. The mystery wasn't just solved, it was transformed into something achingly beautiful and profound. Tears, the first he'd allowed since the funeral, blurred his vision. Shadow hadn't just needed saving, it had been a guide, bringing Shadow. Home felt entirely different. The house wasn't a tomb anymore, it was a refuge they shared. Arthur set up a soft bed near the radiator, far from the imposing wingback chair. But Shadow, leg bandaged, moved with quiet determination. Ignoring the comfortable bed, it limped slowly, purposefully, across the living room rug. Arthur watched, his heart in his throat. The cat paused before the dusty wingback, Evelyn's chair. It looked up at the empty seat, then slowly, carefully, gathered itself. With a soft grunt of effort, it leaped up, landing lightly despite its bandaged leg. It circled once, kneaded the worn fabric with its good front paw. a gesture echoing 1,000 memories of Mr. Paws, of Evelyn, and then settled. Not in the center, but curled on the left side, the spot Evelyn had always favored. It let out a deep, shuddering sigh, a sound of profound relief and finality, and closed its eyes. It wasn't waiting for a ghost anymore. It was claiming its place. It was home. Arthur sank to his knees beside the chair, the tiny compass warm in his palm. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently rested it on Shadow's head, between the ears. The cat didn't stir, but the steady rise and fall of its breathing, the faint, rumbling purr that started deep in its chest, vibrated against his fingers. It was the deepest connection he'd felt in half a year. He looked at the chair. No longer just a symbol of loss, but now holding a living, breathing creature embodying loyalty and a message of love. Shadow had weathered the storm, carried its precious cargo through danger, and found its harbor. Arthur, by opening the door, had found his way back to a different kind of wholeness. He leaned his forehead against the armrest, beside the sleeping cat, the compass pressed between his palm and its fur. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was peaceful, filled with the soft rhythm of Shadow's purr and the gentle patter of rain against the now safe windows. Weeks later, the first frost glistened on the grass outside. Arthur sat in his own armchair, a book open but unread on his lap. The fire crackled softly. On Evelyn's chair, now brushed clean, Shadow lay curled in a pool of sunlight, fur glossy and full, the sprain long healed. Its chest rose and fell, in deep, contented sleep. The tiny brass compass attached to a new, soft collar gleamed faintly against its gray fur. Arthur watched the sleeping cat, a quiet warmth spreading through him deeper than the fire's heat. Shadow had honored Evelyn's memory in a way no human could, bridging the chasm of grief with silent devotion and a tarnished charm. It had fought the storm, faced the darkness, and delivered its star. And in doing so, it had shown Arthur that love never truly leaves. It sometimes just finds a different, quieter, fiercely loyal way to come home. He wasn't alone in the empty chair's shadow anymore. He was sharing the light with the cat who carried the stars home.